Take a look behind the curtain with a real whistleblower and American patriot. Prepare to embrace the uncomfortable truth because this program has no time for comforting lies. Here is civil liberties enthusiast, Second Amendment defender, and recovering FBI agent Kyle Seraphin.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Kyle Seraphin Show. Today is Tuesday, August the 8th. It's 8/8. If you're Frank Figliuzzi, the former FBI Assistant Director of Counterintelligence, this day has vast significance to you in your white supremacy-ladled brain. But for those of us who are regular people, it does not. It's simply a Tuesday, and it's a Tuesday when our government is engaging in malfeasance and going after regular citizens and infringing in the First Amendment protected activities like the freedom to assemble, the freedom of the press. Not surprising to any of you. Before we get into my guest today, we're going to be bringing on Steve Baker. He joined me for my first and probably longest video interview where we went over 3 hours, where we were going into Joe Rogan territory. We had to break it up into 3 pieces for you, and I will put the link below when we finish the show so you guys can go see that if you haven't seen the original discussion we have. But we're going to bring it back on because there's been some important developments, and one of the things that we know is that the FBI listens to this podcast, and if we are going to thumb our nose at anybody, we are going to do it here on this show. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Thanks for being part of the show. Let me pay some bills real quick and say thanks to my folks over at Catholic Vote. You guys know that you can sign up for the Loop. There's my copy of the Loop right there coming straight out of my email. I'm going to look at my phone here today, Tuesday the 8th. We've got issue number 1 is on the ballot in Ohio. Folks, if you want to go out and vote on that, check out the Loop. First of all, you just go to catholicvote.org, put in your email address and your zip code. You'll find out that you can go vote in Ohio on their constitutional amendment about abortion rights, trying to get rid of that, or trying to add it rather. Very important stuff. Library director resigns over pornography in Virginia libraries. I think that's going to be relevant to you all. The Boston mayor is banning gas power in city work. Fantastic. That seems like a real smart move by Mayor Wu, the Democrat out there. And a couple of things about the Gallup poll, the resurgence, and what we're seeing is more and more LGBTQ plus people identifying in every generation. There's a whole list of stuff like that. Handful of others, cashless society, the fears that we have, Australia as a harbinger for some of the ills that are coming down the line, and a new Loopcast, which is their podcast. So check out the Loop. Go see my friends over there. And of course, you can always join our free the merch type, our free the cup type. Ryan's actually got his in his post office box. I don't know if he actually went and grabbed it, but you can go to patriotcoolers.com with promo code Kyle, Kyle, or click in the show notes right below here. You'll be able to do it. You don't even have to load the promo code. I've actually got it loaded in there for you. You'll get 10% off. So if you see something you like there, by all means, check it out. Without too much further ado, I want to bring on Mr. Steve Baker, the pragmatic constitutionalist, who has a locals account you can find. We'll add that to the notes. Steve, thanks for joining me, bud. And I see that you are wearing your team colors today. You're in Team CIA, apparently.
Absolutely. I am part of the agency.
The agency, as it is known by those of us who work in the government. Would you say that you trust the CIA now more than you do the FBI?
I'll tell you what, the only possible rationale for that is that still technically the CIA is supposed to work overseas more than here domestically. So maybe, I guess so. Yeah.
I've got buddies who are CIA whistleblowers who literally told me that they have more faith in the agency that they've blown the whistle on that has fired them than the agency I used to work for.
That is amazing.
That's scary stuff, right?
Yeah. I mean, as far as I know, I haven't been moved on by the CIA yet, but I have been moved on by the FBI. So I have a real problem with your former organization.
Yeah, you and me both. All right, let me just start off by asking folks, if you are in the live chat, and many of you are, if you want to add a question, you'd like something answered that Steve may have a unique perspective on, please add it in the comments below. So scroll below the live chat, put it in the comments. It's easier for Ryan to screenshot them and bring them on screen later on, and we'll get to those as they come down. And why don't we start off with just letting people know a little bit about who you are. Not everybody saw the original interview we did, although we spent an awful lot of time on it. So give people a rundown, maybe, from your early youth, and then kind of how you ended up sitting here on the show again.
My early youth. Well, before I start that, I will tell you, all of your viewers, they need to go listen to that first interview. That was actually one of the most enjoyable interviews I've ever done, because we went pretty deep.
We had a lot of fun there.
Yeah, especially by the time we got to the third segment, third hour, we were into some pretty deep esoteric stuff. So I enjoyed it.
That's true. And also we were deep in the bladder territory where it was we were going to have a time clock after it run out.
Right. That's right. Well, my youth, if I have to start there. No, I'm a lifelong musician. I have been a trumpet player and vocalist most of my adult life. I started touring when I was a kid. I left school at 19 to go on the road and travel all over the world and did that sort of thing. In the process of that, I got involved with some organizations that were doing work behind the Iron Curtain, ministry organizations, missionary organizations. I got involved with groups that were, smuggling printing press parts and uh, tape duplicating machines, recording the gear, all this kind of stuff to support the underground dissident movement inside the Soviet Union. And that's a long story in and of itself. But then while I'm doing all of that and traveling back and forth from being on the road and being home in my home state of Louisiana, my father's also a private investigator. So this whole thing of is in my blood. It's kind of a DNA type thing that's been handed to me. And then I started writing just as a hobby back in the '80s, and then by the time the internet came around, I was flourishing online. I started off on CompuServe and AOL, and then all of that became MySpace, and then MySpace became Facebook, and then Facebook became a blog, and here we are today.
Right.
And so that was the kind of the genesis of this. But for most of my quote unquote writing career and political analysis and commentary and that sort of thing, that was just a hobby for me. And it wasn't until COVID came to town and they locked the country down, and particularly here in North Carolina where I live now, I wasn't allowed to work for a year and a half. I mean, live music is my business. It's what I do to pay my bills, and it's what I have done for most of my life. So I was suddenly not allowed to work. And so after, two weeks to flatten the curve became 2 months. And then I realized it could be as long as 2 years. I thought, well, I better monetize this hobby of mine. And so I kicked that into high gear, started doing that. And, it didn't really change anything that I was doing, other than obviously I was obsessed with COVID and writing and investigating all things related to that farce. But when January 6th rolled around, that was just part of my schedule. By then I was writing full time. I wasn't playing music. So I was traveling the country, meeting with my bloggers, or my blog followers all over the country. During the lockdowns, I traveled to 28 states, and we would have meetings in defiance. We would create speakeasies where they didn't exist, and we would meet up. And
what were those meetings like, out of curiosity, too?
It was phenomenal. The very interesting thing about those meetings, some of them were in people's homes, some of them were in businesses that weren't open because they were locked down, but the owner would open them for us. Some of them were out in rural counties, so it would be outside of a major city where they were completely locked down, but then they would be in a county where the sheriff didn't enforce the lockdowns, which happened all over the country, as you know. And so those were the kinds of places that we would meet. And of course, it was liberating for everybody, because we weren't able to do anything back home, depending upon where your home was. And so for most people, this was a liberating time to be able just to go out and meet with other people. So it was really
cool. Isn't it so interesting that just meeting up with strangers and sharing ideas was the defiance? And in many ways, it's probably a lot like what you were doing when you were running around behind the Iron Curtain, where you're running around the Soviet Union. I mean, you got to experience tyranny on two fronts. I'm sure you probably didn't expect it coming back home to the United States, though.
No, I never did. And in fact, I'll tell you a quick story. I was sitting in a dissident leader's home in Tallinn, Estonia. This was 1983.
You say in Estonia?
In Estonia, yeah.
Okay.
The Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic back then. Mm-hmm. And I was secreted to his home by just like you would see in a movie. I mean, I met in a cafe, and then we jumped in a cab, and then from a cab we got on a trolley, and then from a trolley into a private car, and from a private car back into another cab, and then finally after dark we end up at this leader's home. All the lights were out, the windows of course were covered. And then after sitting by myself in his living room for quite some time, he comes wandering out from the dark back room, and he walks and he sits at the couch across from me, and he holds up a pen just like this, or it was actually a pencil, and he said, here, this is what the government tells us that truth looks like. He said, but because we can get Finnish television across the Baltic from here, we know that truth looks like this. And man, I've never forgotten that, and I never dreamed that I would be living that today here in our own country.
Where the government literally is spinning truth and trying to influence public perception. I think they've always done that. So I'm kind of curious. My dad is in his mid 70s or early to mid 70s, and I'm in my early 40s, and you're kind of in between there. I grew up with a fundamental distrust of the government. I think my dad grew up with the opposite of that, but kind of saw that, growing during the Vietnam anti-war movements and so on. What was your feeling about the government's involvement and whether or not they would be truthful with the citizens in the United States as you grew up?
Well, when I grew up, I think that we were all much more trusting. First of all, we may not have liked the other political side, depending upon which side of the aisle you voted for, but we were more trusting that, okay, all right, the other guys won, but they're going to tell us the truth, and they're going to take care of us, and they're going to be somewhat forthright and honest. Well, obviously, we had our scandals. Watergate was, when I was in junior high school, and of course, then we had to go through the end of the Vietnam War in '75, and then we had to go through the Carter administration, and then suddenly things began to, as I grew, I was growing older, I was growing more aware, and becoming more perceptive, I think, of the reality that one of the inherent functions of government is, as you mentioned before, is just to color the truth. They're not going to be honest with us on a macro sense by any means. They can justify any lie, and they'll do it for security, national security reasons, or oh God, I mean, look at what we're facing right now, and in terms of what they're trying to spend for security reasons. And then the other reality is that once you get a little bit older and you become even a little bit more aware, you become much more attuned to the fact that they're probably not telling you the truth about anything. At least everything, as you said, has a spin to it to some degree and to some extent, and that's coming from every side. And that's been the most stark realization in my career as a writer, and as someone who is now moving in the circles and meeting with Congress members and meeting with congressional staff members on a regular basis. You just don't know what is real, what's not, and you don't know what's being taken back, and you don't know when they look you right in the face and tell you how serious they are about following through on this particular issue. You've made your impact. You've seen their eyes light up. You've seen them drop their jaw when you tell them that you know something they need to know, and then they write down your name and your number, and they give it to a staffer and say, call him, and then you don't ever hear from that staffer again.
I think that's the big thing, where you feel like you've made the impact like a normal human being would. If you and I had that impact made on us, then we would be making that call in a couple days, and there's nothing. There's just no follow through. Right. I'm getting somewhere with this. So what was your relationship growing up? You said your dad is a private investigator. What was your relationship with the FBI, either by reputation or any interactions with it until 2021?
Well, my perception of the FBI came from Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. and in the 1960s, 70s television series. I grew up with that. I mean, I am that old. And so they were the good guys. And then, of course, the Untouchables, Elliot Ness. I was all over that, played by Robert Stack. That was awesome. So that was the kind of thing that I grew up with. And my perception is that they were the white hat guys out there, and that there was, if there was truth, justice, in the American way, it was going to be performed and or executed by those guys. And certainly you thought of maybe these guys as being a little bit spookier in the background there. And then when I was working behind the Iron Curtain, I'm the only guy that I know in my entire life who's ever been strip searched by the KGB. Well, you're looking at him. I don't know if you know anybody who has been, but
I'm not off the top of my head, but I've run in enough circles. I probably could find somebody as well. You're probably not unique in that, but it's not common.
Right. You probably could. But point being is that I was engaged in activities that eventually led to that.
Yeah, sure.
So, that I certainly during that time thought that these guys in the FBI were the good guys.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a natural. It'd be hard to do a lot of the things that you were involved in or think the way that we did, I think, up until very recently. How much has post January 6th shaded your impression of what our government is involved in?
I have a new axiom related to January 6th that came afterward. I have lots of operational working axioms in my writing career. My first lead line is always as a basically as a political libertarian is that there's the world we want versus the world in which we actually live. And I say that, and that's why I call myself a pragmatist. Is there is the world that we want. If I took the test, I'm probably a political anarchist, but I'm more rational than that, and I know that that's just as unworkable in humanity, in human nature, as is communism. That neither of those extremes work. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's the world that I want, but that's not the world in which we live. We don't live in a world where we can have open borders. And of course, that's a libertarian flag. Well, yeah, I would love a world with open borders. I would love a world that was safe enough that we could have open borders. We don't live in that world. So that's what that axiom means. But the one related to January 6th that popped up since then was that I will never again believe anything that I don't see with my own eyes. But then check the videotape.
Because what you saw is not necessarily what actually happened to.
That's correct. Because I took hours worth of video that day. And it wasn't until after I did, 5 days of frame by frame analysis of my own video that I just became aware of what was going on in that crowd.
Sure. Well, I had a book of quotes I grew up with. It was like one of those toilet reading books. You reach back and you read a quote from famous people. And one of them that I've always it stuck with me since I was a teenager was if you want to know what history is, go talk to two different people that were involved in an automobile accident and then try to figure out whether anybody knows what happened. Yeah. And it's something to that effect. I'm butchering it in a little way, but essentially the fact that we all bring a significant lens to whatever happened, and we brought our emotions and our expectations and our assumptions to it, and then there's what actually happened on the videotape, like you just mentioned. Yeah. I put out a tweet earlier this week, and I think it got some traction because I think it resonates with a lot of people. It upset a lot of people as well. But one of the things that I've been sort of musing on, the sphere of Twitter is like how condensed can you get an interesting idea? And what I said is the United States I grew up in would have invaded the United States that I live in. What do you think about that?
Being a libertarian, I would hope that we would not have invaded, but I think we would have probably been compelled to respond and attack, probably in a treaty we had with somebody because of the malfeasance that the United States that we live in today is participating in their country. So we probably would have had a treaty with somebody that we would have had to attack.
I see things like Urgent Fury. I see things like Just Cause as sort of examples from the 80s. And I was a little kid from a lot of that, but I still have recollections. I actually jumped out of an airplane at Fort Benning on the 20-year anniversary of Just Cause with guys who jumped into Panama. So I had jumped, guys from my stick were jumpers in there as well. And they were doing kind of a memorial jump. And I don't know, for some reason, it's just, when you start stepping into the Banana Republic realm and you start delegitimizing all these institutions that we sort of grew up trusting. I mean, even in the 80s and 90s, I grew up trusting these things in the way that you probably remember as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then, and even things like Ruby Ridge, even though they bothered me, and even things like Waco, which my dad was integrally, involved in, having talked to the guys inside the compound, it still didn't shake me the way that I feel like what's been going on with January 6th has shaken me.
I have one of my closest friends in the world. I don't remember whether we mentioned him in my our 3-hour marathon previously, but he's a wounded veteran, lost an arm in the Sinai Desert. He stepped on a landmine on a peacekeeping mission back after Anwar Sadat was assassinated. What was that, 81 or 82, somewhere in there. And he was a Ranger and also 101st Airborne, and he was a lieutenant leading a recon in the desert, and he triggered one of those what do they call them, bouncing Bettys, or jumping Judys, whatever the hell they call them. So
bouncing Bettys is what I've always heard them called.
So he triggered that, and then he ordered his guys to retrace their steps and get out of the minefield that they had wandered into. And this was a mine that had been planted in the Yom Kippur War back in '69, and so the circuitry had degraded just enough that once his guys were clear, and he made a break for it to try to get away. expecting to die, but he managed to get far enough away. It didn't kill him, but it took his arm off, almost took one of his legs off. He's 100% deaf even today. He has the cochlear implants, tons of other medical problems related to that. He's lost half of a foot from that as well.
Let me just jump in to tell people what this landmine situation is. So it's a spring-loaded explosive device that lives under the ground. It's buried down there, and then when you put enough pressure on it, a human pressure, it activates the spring release. So when you lift a foot, it bounces up chest high, waist high, face high, etc., to make the most explosive, as opposed to blowing up from the ground where you get a limited cone of explosion. It gets up and detonates so that it causes the most amount of damage. Really nasty stuff. Things that people are not supposed to use in most war zones right now. I think they actually had one of those things in Bad Boys too, now that I think about it, in that scene at Guantanamo. But it's a horrific device, and to be standing there basically on something you assume is going to kill you is it's got to be probably one of the most harrowing decisions. And of course, heroic to have your guys walk back out of it and run. But that's what we're talking about. Okay, so he lost an arm, he's thoroughly banged up.
Yeah, he thought he was going to, of course, die. He was air vac'd to Israel. The Israeli doctors were much more experienced back in that era with that type of trauma, and they saved his life. And years later, the guy's had an incredibly productive life, even as a double amputee, and has he's a scuba diver. He owns 2 boats. He's had a great career otherwise. And he told me when we were watching some of the results of these Oathkeeper trials, for instance, related to January 6th, and we were together, and he just broke down and he just started bawling. He was so upset by that because he saw what the government was doing to these innocent men and the manipulation. And he said, is this the country that I gave up this for?
Right. No, it has to be truly troubling. And I think a lot of veterans are looking in the same way. And that was so troubling about that particular day. Give people a background, and then we'll dig into the the updates to it. But what was your involvement in January 6th and kind of the Cliff Notes version, or if you want to put the bullet points out there so people can kind of do it, and then I'll refer them back to our long form because we talked about that obviously at length.
Yeah. The real quick elevator pitch on that is that as I said, I was now out of work in my other job, so I moved my political analysis and writing and commentary, investigative work into the captain's chair of my life. And so January 6th was put on the calendar. Trump announced something wild was going to happen on December 19th of 2020. And me and another very successful writer friend of mine from here in Raleigh, we decided to go up together and check it out. I had no idea what to expect that day. I was thinking maybe, because there was all of this talk about the potential election fraud, and that they had all these investigations that had been doing, and that there was going to eventually be the release of the Kraken, if you remember that.
Yep.
I thought, okay, well, if they're going to release the Kraken, it's got to be on January 6th. We're down to the 2 weeks before the actual inauguration of President-elect Biden at that point. So if they're going to release the Kraken, it better be there. So we loaded up in my car, and we rode up to D.C. and got a room in Arlington, did that whole routine, went over there the next morning, froze our butts off, and at 30-mile-an-hour crosswind and a January Wednesday. We were completely unimpressed with every person that was on the stage. Me not being a Trump supporter, more so than even my friend. And then we decided about halfway through Trump's speech to start working our way towards the Capitol building, which thousands of people were already peeling off and doing that at the time, because there were announced events that day. And this is something a lot of Americans don't understand. There were scheduled permitted events at the Capitol to follow. And Trump, he messed up even those, because he messed up the schedule because he didn't take the stage until an hour late down at the Ellipse. He was scheduled to speak at 11, and the first events were to begin around 12:30 or 1 at the Capitol. And it's quite a long walk, and there was no car traffic open that day because of the size of the crowds and it being a major protest day.
Yep.
So the bottom line is that by the time we got to the Capitol, it was already after 1 o'clock. Trump was still on stage. He didn't leave the stage till 1:16 p.m. And we could see the from our vantage point near the reflection pool, the Peace Monument area. We could see hear the flashbangs. We could see the tear smoke. We could see arrival of DC Metro Police, their fluorescent vests coming down the steps, feverishly arriving, and their sirens going off, and we're like, oh man, what is going on? And I looked at my buddy. I said, well, that's where we're headed, and we raced it up there to the West Terrace. And by the time we got there, the battle had already been engaged for some time, because the first barricade breach was at 12:53 p.m. I turned my camera on at 1:19, so it was nearly it was over 25 minutes after violence had begun before I started filming. And then once I captured about an hour's worth of video, not knowing that there had been a breach now of the building itself, but there was now a free flow of humanity going up the steps there, where we've seen the scaffolding that were covered with canvas that had been ripped off by the protesters, and now people are just moving up as freely as in a mall. And I finally joined behind several hundred people and went up there myself. When I got to the upper terrace, I look over and there's hundreds of people moving into the building. And so I, of course, never saw the breach of the building, never saw why the doors were opened. But once that was clear that people were going in, I joined in the line and went in. And so I started the process of doing nothing more than behaving as a journalist. In fact, I've seen myself on Capitol CCTV stopping and taking notes. I would, video. I'd take my backpack off. I had my camera gear. I had a tripod. I had extra batteries. I had my man on the street microphone, because that was what I was planning on doing that day, was interviewing people about if the Kraken got unleashed. I had no idea that this was going to happen, but I had to my instincts were to follow the story where the story went. So you can, as I said, you could see me inside the Capitol building. People are moving around, and I've shut my camera off, and I've got my phone out, and I'm standing against a wall typing for 10 or 15 minutes. I don't even remember doing that, talking about memories of, in a
right
crime or something like that. Especially
what was the physiological sensation of being there? What was the either the sympathetic reactions, or, what were your memories that you do have? What do you remember the feeling of being in that crowd?
Well, when I first started filming on the battle line, on the West Terrace, but my feelings were, I had no I would say I had no identifiable emotions of any kind. It was just, I had one intention, and that was to capture the best that I could on film, because I knew that history was being made. You didn't
have a team that you were going, go police, go rioters, or go Trump guys.
No, because I had, as I said, I didn't know what I was seeing, except, because your mind can only take in about 5% in a highly violent kinetic situation like that. And then you're looking through a small lens anyway. And then when you start getting hit by pepper spray, and you start getting hit, you're downwind from this spray. I was never doing anything to have it aimed at me, because I was never assaulting police officers or attacking the line in any way. But when you got a 30-mile-an-hour north wind coming, and you're on the south side of that, you're going to catch some of it.
Sure.
And so I eventually moved over to the north side so I could avoid that spray, which put me in that position underneath where that scaffolding was. And now I'm over where some really violent activity is taking place. And now the guys over there, they've got the rubber bullet guns, they've got the grenade, flashbang grenades, all of the quote unquote less than lethal munitions that they were using, including those big tanks of pepper spray. And so I've got, camera in one hand and my eyeballs on those guys with those big tanks of pepper spray. So, because I don't want to be near anybody deserving of him pulling the trigger on them. So your brain can only take in so much. So there was a protective nature going on right there, self-preservation. I did get hit by one of the flashbangs. It exploded about 3 feet off to my right. Shrapnel came up, hit me. I had a bruise on the side of my knee for about 6 months after that. So just being in the area, there were those kinds of concerns, but I didn't have any. I felt no political oriented sensations whatsoever until I left the building, because when I left the building, I saw and filmed and videoed the extraction of Ashley Babbitt out of the building by the EMT units, and I'm the only cameraman that did capture that.
So many people will have seen that footage, and it's out there in lots of different places, as we know. Let me, just before we go and talk about inside the building, because I think that's going to be critical to discussion why DOJ is interested in you. I think we had a question that was put out there by Jigsaw Massacre, one of our regulars. It says, did you witness the flare being shot over the Capitol building at 2:45, 3 p.m.? And if so, do you have any idea what its purpose was?
2:45? No, I was inside the building at that time.
Okay, so at that point, you're marching around inside. Okay, fair enough. All right, so you're inside.
Let's be clear. We got to be really precise in our speech here. I was not marching.
Yes, you were walking around and observing and documenting things as a journalist.
Marching and parading is an actual misdemeanor charge. So.
Isn't that amazing that we're in such a strange, silly world of that? All right, my buddy Steve Friend mentioned, and I know you've talked to him at length, and one of the things he said is that you're going to be charged for upsetting a bench inside the Capitol, and that was one of the things that I think that they were really honed in on. You've been interviewed by the FBI at least once that I'm aware of. Was there another interview?
There was an attempted interview that was aborted prior to my actual 2-hour interview, in which my attorney and I showed up at the field office here in Raleigh, and they met us at the door and said, hey, we may not be able to do this interview today. And we're like, okay. They said, just give us a few minutes. We'll be back in about 10 minutes. We're on the phone determining whether we can do this or not. And I had no idea what was going on. So they went back in the back. We sat in the lobby, and it took them about a half hour before they came out. And when they came out, they said, yeah, we can't do this, because of your status as a journalist press, we can't do this interview without express written permission from the U.S. Attorney General's office. I didn't even know such a code existed in the federal code, but it actually does. And so as a result of that, it took about another 2 months, actually over 2 months, before we actually did the interview, because it took that long for the letter of approval from the U.S. Attorney's office, and the negotiation with my attorney, and then the final proper letter that we agreed to for the interview.
All right. And then you've had recent contact. This is obviously why we're back out here talking about this again. So we've entitled this episode The Subpoena. You had a text message. It showed up on Twitter that you posted from your attorney. Just walk people through what that was, what the emotions were of getting it, and then what it turned out to be. Yeah.
It's like 10:25 a.m. this past Friday. I get a text from my attorney, and it's my Raleigh attorney, not my DC attorney, telling me that he was contacted by one of the agents that interviewed me 2 years ago, and said that they had a service of process that they needed to get to me, and did they need to go through him or execute that directly to me. So he said, well, I don't know. Let me check with Steve. So he called me right up, or I called him right back from the text, and I what the heck's going on here, man? He said, I don't know. I have no idea what it is. It's just they notified me of service process, and I said, call him back, tell him you'll take it, but ask him what the hell it is. And it turns out it is a subpoena from the district court there in DC, demanding demanding copies of all my videos that I took on January 6th. Now, that doesn't sound so ominous, except that there's a problem. A couple of key legal technical details you might be intimately aware of. The first thing is this is a grand jury subpoena. A grand jury is not seated for misdemeanor charges, right? Only for felony charges. Even in January 6 cases, your former colleagues may SWAT people for misdemeanor charges, but they are not sent there by a grand jury decision.
Sure.
The other problem with this subpoena, once it was picked up by my attorney yesterday morning, is that this particular subpoena is signed by the actual assistant U.S. attorney who was handling my case over 20 months ago, meaning after my DC attorney saw it, and he called me up and he said, okay, he said, you probably already figured it out, but this is not good. And I said, okay, why is it not good? And he said, well, 3 levels. Number one, as you know, if there's a grand jury looking at you, it's not for a misdemeanor, it's for some felony. Second thing is the fact that this particular AUSA is the signatory means that this is your case. They're not looking at your videos for somebody else's crime or case, or And I said, okay, well, well, what's the third thing? He said, well, the other thing that makes it evident that they're looking at you is that if they were looking at you specifically, they would have to subpoena only your tools of trade, the video itself. They can't subpoena you on your case, right? So they can't bring the suspect into the grand jury.
Mm-hmm.
He said that means, he said that they are in fact, because if this was just a witness testimony, if they just needed to know what you saw and you needed to authenticate your video, they could just call you in to testify on somebody else's case. He said the fact that they're calling your video in means they're looking at you.
So three steps. Yeah. So let me just break that down. 3 steps. You're saying 1, felony because it's a grand jury. Okay, I can get behind that. 2, you're saying that there is it's targeting you specifically because the assistant United States attorney, the prosecutor that was looking at you initially, is the one who signed off on the subpoena.
Right.
And then the third is because they are not asking you to testify. It is likely specifically about you. They're just getting information, data that you have, and not your personal testimony.
Correct.
I think it's a fair guess. That is still kind of an educated guess. Obviously, it's not conclusive, right? But
it is not conclusive from the subpoena itself.
Sure.
But you and I both know that I've been really hard on them for the last 20 months.
as is appropriate.
Right.
Now, there's some interesting things in the subpoena, and I think you have it in front of you, or you have at least the text of it. Do you want to read some of that interesting stuff? Because I think people will find that to be the most concerning.
Yeah, I want to, and I'm absolutely going to be straight up front with this, is that back in our, following my original FBI interview, I should probably lay the groundwork for this, is that following my original interview, it was another month before my attorney received an actual letter or email from the assistant U.S. attorney that was assigned my case. Mm-hmm. Her name is Anita Eve. She's out of Philadelphia. And she actually sent him the email on November 17th of 2021, in which she said, your client, that would be me, is going to be charged within the week. That's an exact quote.
And we talked about it just after that.
Yes. So your client is going to be charged within the week. This was November 21. So that's almost 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then we did a media offensive, did press releases, sent out about 200 press releases to media sources of all sizes. And then I engaged my DC attorney that same week. I actually, for the first time, had a a senator call me. Senator Ron Johnson called me on Tuesday night of that week and asked how he could help. That's how fast the word got out. And then on the Monday following Thanksgiving of 2021, my new attorney, who is a 22-year former federal prosecutor himself, he contacted Anita Eve, who he has acquaintance with, and sent her an email. First thing, said, I'm now representing Mr. Baker and would love to talk. And then she didn't respond, so he placed a phone call to her on the Monday after Thanksgiving. She did not respond, and we never heard from them again for 20 months. Over 20 months has passed until this Friday, and then all of a sudden popped up again.
Now and you've had something of an obsession about January 6th since then, I think rightly so. Can you talk about some of the things that you've been digging into in the interim that may have triggered some animosity from DOJ?
Well, first of all, if you start in my earliest work, I was certainly looking at some of the those odd bird characters in the crowd who nobody been able to figure out who they are yet. I spent a lot of time obsessing over the interesting unindicted provocateurs that were in the crowd, and have written stories about some who have been identified since, and some who haven't. Mm-hmm. Some who have been identified and are still not arrested. Some who have been identified and are now on the lam overseas. Things of that nature. And so then, of course, it ended up, as my investigative trails naturally developed, I ended up in relationship with quite a few of the Capitol Police officers. I ended up developing whistleblowers out of the Capitol Police, some who have actually come out and become whistleblowers, and then others, of course, who are still unnamed sources that would come out if they genuinely believe they would get protection for doing so.
What do they think will happen, out of curiosity?
What's that?
Like, what do they think will happen if they come and speak out, and what do they base that on from your
Every
your
single
discussions?
one of them who has either come out or not says our lives will be destroyed. And this is despite the fact that in the last 2 weeks, there's been 2 separate House administration committee meetings in which the existing existing Capitol Police Board, as well as the new police chief, have both promised the country, right there on C-SPAN, right coming out right out of the hearing rooms, that whistleblowers will be respected, they will be protected, and that is of utmost importance to them, to be sure that the rights and the protections and the procedures are followed for Capitol whistleblowers. To which, of course, I get on the phone with the acquaintances that I've made within both retired and otherwise within the United States Capitol Police, and they all had exactly the same word for what those men said in those hearing rooms. Bullshit.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like what Chris Wray said.
Yeah, I don't, and I don't have to send them a script. That's the first phrase that comes out of their mouth.
Yeah, and so nobody has any faith in the whistleblower protections because we know there's no teeth in them.
No.
And I'm assuming they're seeing what's happened to other people.
They've seen what's happened to you guys. They've seen they've seen the weaponization committee hearings and the way that they were treated, obviously, particularly by the Democrats on that committee, but also how you guys have been treated otherwise. They've seen the IRS whistleblowers and how they were treated. Look, even the Twitter files guys, Taibbi and Schellenberger and all, they're to have congressmen calling them so-called journalists.
Right.
And I'm like, hello, Me Too.
Right.
Talk about a Me Too movement right now. And so these are the kinds of things that that those guys are up against. And then I don't know where we left off on my particular story here, getting to where we are today. But when we got the when I got the I've got to go back to November of 21, because there was an exchange between my Raleigh attorney, and this assistant U.S. attorney, and part of that exchange was when my press release went out on the Monday of Thanksgiving week. That went out at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, Thanksgiving of 2021. By 1:15. She already had a copy of the press release because she's monitoring my comms, or somebody is.
Sure.
And she sent a copy of that press release to my attorney and said, "We're not happy about this." To which my attorney responded, "Well, why? Are you saying that my client should forego his First Amendment right to talk about the persecution that he's potentially about to undergo from the federal government?" To which she responded and said, "No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that a judge who eventually handles his case will not look favorably upon this. And so I'm just, concerned for him."
Let's hang in that little space for just a moment, if you would.
All right.
So the First Amendment says that Congress can make no law that bridges our freedom of speech and assembly and the press and so on, right? And so we have this belief that the government is not supposed to weigh in on that arena. And yet over and over, that's what we see. Like, there's no other way around it. The FBI is involved in First Amendment protected activities, whether it's going after, parents at school board meetings who are speaking out and have that right, or people that are in a Catholic church that want to do the Latin Mass and that's their, they should be free from government intervention, or journalists who are engaging in a traditionally protected activity of covering newsworthy events.
Right.
I mean, was there ever a time that you recall journalists were being prosecuted for being, let's say, on the wrong side of a riot when they were capturing footage of said riot?
No, and of course, just being a journalist is not carte blanche to be anywhere at any time. Whether we're talking about state law as it applies to journalistic activities or federal law, you do in fact not have the right to cross a restricted area line or to enter a private facility without permission from whoever owns that property. And the same thing is true of even if it's an arbitrary restriction at the Capitol that day. I mean, they were under quote unquote COVID protocols, so technically the Capitol was not open to the public. And then technically, even though the Capitol Police had issued permits for protest on the lawns and indeed on the steps of the Capitol, which were then set up arbitrarily inside restricted spaces, it still doesn't technically give a journalist a right to access there. On the other hand, as is adjudicated, innumerable times, both state and federally, is that when a journalist does safely and behaving themselves professionally, does follow a riot, a crowd, or a crime scene into a restricted area, they're generally, it's like, okay, we understand why you were there.
There's that kind of newsworthy exception that has always sort of existed,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. And and there are exceptions to that as well. There are times when journalists have been prosecuted for trespassing.
Sure. Now, one of my acquaintances, Bill Shipley, who's been defending a lot of January 6ers and has taken on and set up sort of legal defense for them, former federal prosecutor, has articulated the following, and I think it's worth noting that in his view, and I think it's the right view, the federal government doesn't have any skin in the outcome of a prosecution. That people like me, who did my old job, their job is to go out and uncover whatever truth it is, build whatever the strongest case it is, including exculpatory evidence if that exists. And they are supposed to put that out. And the judge's job is to mediate things fairly and to make sure that they are in consistent due process is done. And the prosecutor's job is to mount a credible prosecution, and the defense's job is to make the best defense possible. And the jury's job is to sort out which is true, which is false, and whether it meets the standard as given by pattern jury instructions. And nobody really has any skin in the outcome. The outcome is sort of supposed to be outside of the emotional realm of whether or not we won or we lost. It's not about that sort of thing.
Or the financial realm.
All of those things are not supposed to really come into it. There's not a punishment aspect of the prosecution. We're supposed to be agnostic in the way that the process is meted out. In fact, the government's only interest, according to Bill Shipley, and I think is very, very interesting, is that fair process is supposed to be done. That's the government's primary interest. The rest of it, like the outcome, guilty, not guilty, acquitted, mistrial, hung jury, all these things are not really part of the government's interest, because why would it care?
No,
the government.
Exactly. If it is indeed the Department of Justice, then that should be the only end goal. That should be the only end game. But that's not what I have seen in these January 6 trials. I have seen firsthand with my own eyes, sitting in the courtroom, I have seen the deliberate manipulation of evidence. I've seen the deliberate expungement or the courts block the judges in a highly prejudicial way, allowing inculpatory evidence and excluding exculpatory evidence that was equal and opposite and should have countered each other's in any fair-minded jury's eyes. And I've seen that block. I've seen the DOJ and the judges collude. I've seen, witnessed, and heard the FBI agents lie on the stands. I'm talking about bald-faced lies. And as you know, I've had access to the 41,000 hours worth of videotape. And one of my stories is I am going to show that conclusively I've got the smoking gun. I have the kill shot to prove a case where that happened in one of these trials.
On top of that, they're telling you to be quiet. And there was something in your subpoena, I believe, that mentioned something very similar to what the instinct of we're not happy about you speaking out with your original press release. Can you kind of flesh that out for people?
Yeah, I'll just read it. This is penned by the same AUSA who told me that they were not happy about my press release 20 months ago. And the cover letter of my subpoena actually says this in the final paragraph before her signature. And I quote, "Although you are not required to do so, you are requested not to disclose the existence of this subpoena." Just let that set in for a minute, Kyle.
Yeah, just read that again. I think that's worth a repeat.
Although you are not required to do so, you are requested not to disclose the existence of this subpoena. Now, let me keep going from there. And any such disclosure could impede the investigation being conducted and thereby interfere with the enforcement of the law.
They're threatening you with obstruction.
Absolutely. That's it. All that paragraph was designed for was because she knew that the last time they threatened me with prosecution, that I executed a media offensive against that threat, and they decided to just go ahead and draw the line right here. They put a red line down, and so they admit in the first before the first comma that it's not illegal for me to do so. Although you are not required to do so, it says, you are requested not to disclose the existence of the subpoena. We hear about grand jury subpoenas all the time in the news.
Well, the first thing is they sent you a non-sealed, publicly available, through public means. They sent you a letter, a document that you have physical, they didn't come and show it to you and say, hey, we're showing you this and then we're taking it and you need to comply with it. There's nothing classified about what was there. There's nothing that gives them the right to conceal this information. And once it's in your possession, you can do with it whatever you like.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something that happened to our friend Steve Friend. He was on the recipient end of a investigative target letter from the Internal Affairs Unit that basically said, you are being told in no uncertain terms that you are not allowed to disclose the existence of this particular investigation into your spouse. You can't disclose this to your attorneys. And none of these things have any legal standing. And yet they're out there, they're out there going and attacking people in the public space simply under threat of force. And for me, this is where it gets really, really scary, because who in the world told them that this was a technique that they could utilize? And how high up does it go to approve that sort of thing? How far has our government fallen where they think that they are able to weigh in on people under threat of essentially violence, right? Because we're talking about men with guns coming to your home.
And this is not just a warning not to exercise my First Amendment privilege as a journalist. This is a warning against my First Amendment privilege as a citizen writ large in this particular paragraph. In this,
and there's no legal distinction in the Constitution of what is and what is not the press.
No,
there's some case law that has basically established what we would consider regular press. People use the term citizen journalist, but I think it's wrong. I think we're all just citizens, and you have the ability to engage in journalism should you choose to.
Yeah, you can start a newspaper. I mean, whether you're Ben Franklin or Thomas Paine, you can start a flyer, campaign, or you can start a newspaper. And neither one of them had to apply for a permit or a license to do so.
And we're seeing that in a really weird way. The sort of sycophantic government, mouthpieces that exist in the media right now. They're running their stories by the government. They're getting their stories from the government. I've seen this in our own sort of releases. We've shared some information, and I'll just kind of, let you kind of opine on this in a second. But some of the things that I have exposed, Chris Ray doing some of his work and flying around in the jet and all this kind of thing, worked with a journalist, for Daily Wire, Brandon Dre, good guy. We went out there, we put together a piece. I gave him all the background information. I told him where to look and what to dig. He came up with it. The FBI issued a statement, and he included the gist of the statement, but he didn't directly quote them because the direct quote was sort of bullshit, as you mentioned earlier.
Right.
It just was, it was false. They denied everything, and then and they said it in a pretty way. And so him not quoting them got him another phone call saying, we're really displeased with the fact that you didn't include our entire quote, as though they had some right to explain to people how that they were supposed to frame an argument against what was said, and that they had some right to tell people how to think.
Right.
And a lot of this goes in. Have you been following this sort of CISA development, this sort of cognitive infrastructure usage? Are you familiar with that?
Not sure.
Well, let me bang this off you. So in 2018, President Trump signed into law the creation of the new federal agency. It's the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Administration, CISA. Yeah. And CISA, like every other government agency, has been involved in mission creep, right? They've been slowly gaining authorities, and they've been basically pushing themselves into spaces that didn't exist previously. And one of the things that they have written, they have committed to this in writing because infrastructure is their mandate, that they actually have a duty to act in the cognitive infrastructure space. Now, just think about the government doublespeak that's involved in that. But what would you imagine cognitive infrastructure looks like? You're a smart guy. You've been around government doublespeak for a while.
Well, well, first of all, if they say cognitive infrastructure, I would say that would be all encompassing. I don't think that there's any limit on that nomenclature at all.
And the way they frame it is essentially they're talking about your brain matter, your gray matter between your ears. They're going to police what's going on in there and make sure that it's safe. And the way that they do it, and this is critical to what we just spoke about again, and I'll let you kind of come back at me with that. But by protecting the cognitive infrastructure, it gave them license to censor. It gave them the license to make sure that what goes in is only the safe ideas. Right. This is a big piece of where the Twitter files and the Missouri v. Biden case has gone. And even in your case, where they tell you, don't go out there and share this information. They don't want any of the bad information to go out without their spin.
Yeah.
And I'm not even opining in here. They're literally just telling us this in real time. We can go out there and observe in their own words that they think that they have a right to tell you how you should think because it's the safest way for the government. Now they're telling you that you can't even disclose the existence with threat of force and under threat of investigation for obstruction, but with no right to do so. Literally, they're explicitly forbidden from doing that by our Constitution, which in theory, they actually swore an oath to.
And one of the things that we have done over the last 4 days since I was notified that the subpoena was coming was, spent hours on the phone with both my attorneys, and we're just perplexed at what this felony charge is. Again, it's a grand jury, and they were going to charge me with a felony 20 months ago. I don't know if you remember in our first conversation, I told you they were going to charge me with interstate racketeering.
Right, because you made money off your video.
Right. It was absurd on its face. I mean, every single independent journalist on the planet either has a Substack or a Locals page, or they license their videos if they're a videographer and my videos were used in the HBO documentary, the New York Times documentary, as well as news agencies all over the world licensed use of my video. And that's just that's the way it's done. I mean, on January 7th, I had licensing agencies calling me saying, we want to represent your video.
Right.
Well, why did they know to call me, Kyle? Because I was already established as a guy in the media, independent though I may be. I wasn't working for a big company, but I was already established enough to know that by the time my information went out in the interwebs on the evening of January 6th, that there were people that were attuned enough and aware enough of me and my work to follow me and begin calling me. I mean, the first call I got the next morning was from Fox News and said, "Hey, we want to how much for all your video?" And then the next call I got was the aggregators, the Storyful, and I ended up signing a deal with them directly. And so the point.
And just for people to really dig into that, literally, you were threatened with a charge of racketeering.
Yes.
Which is to say an organized crime, that you were in this conspiracy to travel between interstate lines and videotape something that you could not have known was going to happen because nobody else seemed to, because apparently even the Capitol Police missed it and so did all the intelligence agencies, although we don't necessarily believe that. But there was apparently it escaped law enforcement, but it didn't escape Steve Baker, who traveled between states with the intention of videoing something to make money off it.
Hey, right. I'm one of those smart guys,
That's it. So and that's the absurdity of the claim. That's why it's absurd on its face.
That's right.
Because either they admit that they couldn't have foreseen this, or it was foreseeable and they failed, in which case there's a bigger problem than you.
Very nature of an interstate racketeering or racketeering charge is that, first of all, there has to be collusion. First of all, I had to have foreknowledge of a criminal event, and then I crossed state lines, therefore, to profit or to be remunerated for my participation in that criminal event.
Sure.
And so when with a charge of up to 20 years in prison for that. And so that's what they notified that I was going to be charged with the first time. Obviously, our assumption at the time was that they were just trying to scare me into a quick plea deal down to the glorified trespassing charge and get their notch on the belt and send me on my way. And in the earliest conversations with the AUSA and my attorney, the question was from her, your client's not really planning on going to trial with this, is he? And my attorney was like, well, you seen the shit he writes? He's not going to bend a knee. And that's where and here we are 20 months later, and that's exactly where we are again. A grand jury investigation, as you know, and this is mind-boggling to me, and you know it more intimately than I, even though I've read hundreds of January 6 charging documents. You always have the affiant. It's almost always an FBI agent who writes up the criminal complaint and describes in detail the reasons why they believe that there was a crime committed, or 4 or 8 or 11 crimes committed that this particular person needs to be charged with. And then that's handed over to the DOJ. They make the decision. It goes through a grand jury, whatever. And so that's the process. So as my attorney met with him yesterday morning to ask this particular FBI agent, Special Agent Noyes, and he says, "So what's going on with my client? Are you guys? I mean, are y'all reopening up the case against him or whatever?" And he goes, "Oh man, I have no idea. I mean, I don't know." And I'm thinking to myself, you lying bastard. First of all, you were the guy after my first interview who wrote up this document that you felt like that there was sufficient grounds for me to be charged with interstate racketeering. Are you effing kidding me? What did you see in our interview that gave you any idea that that would be a valid assertion or criminal charge? I mean, and what makes me different than any other journalist paid by any agency anywhere in the world, from the New York Times all the way down to like a Substack subscription-based journalist? What sets me apart that I get that? Because I'm the only one out of the over 1,100 people charged with January 6 offenses to this point. I've never seen the word interstate racketeering associated with any other defendant. What made me different? What did I know? And what you said earlier is exactly, well, I should take it maybe as a badge of honor or a compliment, because if their intelligence failed them that day, if Capitol Police intelligence failed them that day, if Metro PD's intelligence failed that day, and I'm the only one that knew,
You're it. Yeah. You're the only guy in the know in America, apparently.
Good for me.
Yeah. Well done. And it is kind of a staggering, like I said, as someone who doesn't have an interest in any of this stuff, when I used to do investigations, it's like, can I disprove my case? That's the way science works. That's the way that a real investigator works from a skeptical position. It's like, let's start with the supposition that he did these things. Well, if he did, then he would have had to have the jump on all the intelligence agencies, on all the different law enforcement agencies. Well, that's illogical. And that's going to be the first line of defense. Maybe I'd be a good investigator for a defense attorney, because so many of these times I see these questions, and the line of questions should be really straightforward. It's like the gotchas are the same on either side. If you start with one premise and you go to disprove it, and it's really easy, that's a really bad case. That's not a case that I want to go on and move forward with. And I used to shoot down cases all the time when they'd pitch them to you. They'd go, well, this person got defrauded out of this money. And it's like, okay, well, where's the fraud? Well, someone showed up and said these things, and then they signed a document. So they voluntarily engaged in transactions, didn't receive payment for it, thought they would, broke the terms of service for their credit card company for accepting, credit cards with no ID. I mean, it sounds like a bummer.
Yeah.
But is there a crime here, and can I actually prove it? And I don't think that I can. And so if you go into those attitudes, like that, you should be basically trying to walk away from cases, not because you don't want to do cases, but because they're not good cases.
Right.
And what is the case against you in that case? Like I said, you're going to have to argue basically that your knowledge and your intelligence base as an independent journalist running around the world with a Substack and with a locals account and some independent subscribers were able to get the jump on the entire U.S. Law enforcement apparatus that was running in the Capitol in that day. It's absurd on its face, one would think. And yet, don't obstruct them, please.
Right. Well, and this is what my suspicion is, and I having seen so many of these trials related to January 6th, is that my suspicion is that they are trying to entrap me in a process crime of some sort right now. I think that that's what they're up to. Like, for instance, there's been over 20 months since I had that. It's been, almost 2 years since my interview with the FBI.
Sure.
And in that too, when I left when I left the interview that day, in the closing comments, we were laughing, joking with the agents and friendly, shaking hands and telling stories, just, being a bunch of guys. And so one of the things they said, look, until this thing is all settled, be sure, don't delete anything from your devices. Don't delete anything from your phone. Don't delete anything from your computer. I'm like, okay, no problem, no whatever. Well, Kyle, that's been 2 years ago. I have a new phone. I have a new computer.
Right.
Before, the reason I got a new computer is I was running out of memory in my old computer. I trashed, untold numbers of gigabytes worth of data out of that computer since then.
Sure. As people do as they move forward, technology continues to move forward. Your abilities, your needs are going to change. Most people swap a phone out. Here's the other thing. you go out there after a Steve Baker and say, listen, he got rid of his phone and we believe that's an obstruction, or we believe that he was trying to conceal evidence. And then you go, what's the regular turnaround rate that is an exchange program with T-Mobile for a phone that is being used? Oh, it's 12 months you're eligible for an upgrade, or 6 months you're eligible for an upgrade. So the average American can go and live his life, but Steve Baker has to live in pause in 2021.
Yeah.
Is that what has to happen? And that's absurd.
And so I am absolutely convinced that this subpoena for my my videos, because first of all right, if they're looking at me, Kyle, they've got me on hundreds of hours of other people's videos that day.
Right.
They've got me on 1,738 CCTV, Capitol cameras that day. They've got me on all manner of cell phone video that they have captured from that day. They've got me on Metropolitan Police body cams that day. Mm-hmm. They have enough video on me to determine whether I committed any crime of any kind that day. I've already said, yes, I was inside the Capitol building. Okay, so first of all, are you going to selectively prosecute me and not the other 80 to 100 mainstream media journalists that followed the story into the building that day? Okay, so you are going to do that because why? Because I didn't work for one of those cartel journalists that provide you guys with information every day? Or is it because I was independent? Or is it because my narrative did not comport with the Pelosi establish and preserve the narrative of January 6th theme? What is the reason why I'm being selectively prosecuted? But more importantly, beyond any shadow of a doubt, it's irrefutable by all available evidence that I did no violence. I broke no stuff. I did not attack any law enforcement officers. I did not parade. I was not wearing Trump gear. I didn't carry a flag. I didn't chant. I never chanted USA, USA. I never said, whose house, our house. I never sang the Star Spangled Banner. I behaved as a journalist that day from the moment I arrived until the moment I left that building. And what are you looking for?
And there is no good answer.
No, where is the felony in this? Except that they're trying to create one right now. And that's what I think that they're up to.
Sadly, I think you're right. And I think that's the country that we're living in, which is why they've discredited. One of the things that has bothered me so much, and people get really upset about Nazi references, but they're so easy to make. It's so easy to draw parallels between what happened in the Third Reich, what happened during COVID tyranny, and so on. They're almost a one-to-one mixture. And one of the first things that went on in the Third Reich was an undermining of the judiciary and the credibility of the judiciary. And so I've covered it on my program, The First Letter to Judges, how they expected the judiciary to rule. And we were seeing a very similar sort of action plan. The fact that they're all being charged in DC, that they're all being charged under a very favorable situation to the government. As you mentioned, the government has basically made arguments earlier on that there's so much video, there's no way they could give access to all of it. And so people are not entitled to a strong defense, a fair defense, that they've thrown out Brady decisions, that they are not giving access to the exculpatory information that should exist.
That's right.
And then we have people that are perjuring themselves, and I'm not seeing Giglio being revealed after all those things. It's just mind-numbing. Where does this go? That's the other real question. You've got more years on the planet than me. You've got maybe closer to the fire, but also you've been kind of a disinterested observer who's trying to document things. Where in the hell does this go? Because I think people are just absolutely flabbergasted, and people like me included.
We may have talked about this in our previous marathon, but the bottom line is, and this is the most important thing that the American people need to know, and this is what I got since I've talked to you. I've actually met with Jim Jordan. I've met with Representative Mike Johnson from Louisiana. I've met with Troy Nell's staff. But the most significant conversation I had was when I had with Jim Jordan. This was 2 months ago, and I got in his face, and I said, "Sir, with all due respect," and I was addressing the fact that he had no intention to address January 6 issues in the weaponization committee. And I said, with all due respect, you do not know and understand what's going on in these courtrooms. And I said, let me just give you a couple of examples. And I did. And I not only told him that I had 2 stories that I couldn't bring to the American public without his protection. Why does a journalist need congressional protection to tell a story? It's because of the weaponization of the government against people like me and the work that I'm doing. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, and I said this, and this is where I'm going, is that the most important thing that we're seeing in these January 6 trials is the weaponization against the First Amendment. It's not, they're not They don't care that somebody took a flagpole to an officer or sprayed them with some bear spray or whatever. If you took a flagpole to an officer, and whatever that crime qualifies you for in terms of your sentencing, if it's 24 months in jail or whatever the case may be, if you also additionally posted on your Facebook page videos and you chanting and you taunting the police and you doing other things like that, then you probably got 48 months.
Right.
All right. If you were a grandmother and you're 60 years old and you walked through the Capitol for 10 minutes and you took a couple of selfies and you walked out, you probably were able to plead down to 2 years probation, $500 fine, 50 hours community service, whatever like that. Go back home and try to repair your life because you were kicked out of all of your clubs and your organizations and, your church and everything else. So after your arrest. And so if you were a grandmother who walked into the building for 10 minutes and you took a couple of selfies and you chanted USA, USA, you got 2 months in prison, 4, 6, 8 maybe. Mm-hmm. If you're an independent journalist and you work for you're an independent journalist. Let's be very clear about this. And you only had a cell phone in your hand and your name is Luke Mogelson and you walked through a smashed window. You didn't go through an open door. You went through a smashed window and you went into the Senate and you caught the famous iconic video of the QAnon shaman praying inside the Senate chamber. If that was you and you submitted your story to the New Yorker and you used the word insurrection and insurrectionists in your story, you haven't been charged with a crime. But if you were a professional videographer from Pensacola, Florida, and you showed up with all of your high-end, expensive professional camera gear, and you went through the exact same window at almost the exact same time as Luke Mogelson, and then you paralleled him throughout all the entire Capitol and into the Senate chamber, recording the same events that Luke Mogelson did, but when you went in and you were a Trump guy and you got caught up in the moment and you said, USA, 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 you got 8 months in prison. That's the only difference between those two men's activities that day. So what are they suppressing? The same thing that they're trying to suppress in the cover letter of my subpoena. They're trying to take this away from us. They're trying to take our words, our speech, our thoughts, our cognitive abilities. And that's what these trials are about. I mean, these are look, the Oath Keepers were convicted of thought crimes. They weren't convicted of violence.
Yeah, they were convicted of conspiracies that didn't actually happen. I've talked about this with prosecutors. I've never seen conspiracy. The only conspiracies that I've ever seen charged when the actual crime did not go down was a crime of violence that was in progress and interrupted because of some special knowledge the government may have had. The great example of that would be you have a wire up, there's a conspiracy to move drugs around and do this other thing. And then in the middle of it, they say, by the way, we're going to go off this guy and we're en route. And then you go interrupt them because you have a duty to sort of protect the public, or you have a duty to stop and notify this person that there's imminent harm coming their way because you know about it. And so the government will go and arrest people en route to a conspiracy to commit murder, let's say, in aid of racketeering or so on. And then they'll get hit with the conspiracy of a thing that didn't happen but was progressing.
Right.
We have, after the fact, no interdiction conspiracy charges that were done without the conspiracy ever being enacted, whatever that conspiracy was. The thought of it was enough.
No proof. In fact, in the Oath Keepers trial, all 7 FBI agents who testified under cross-examination that never one single time did they ever find evidence of an order from Oath Keeper leadership to enter the Capitol, to storm the Capitol, to harm Congress members, to interdict the certification of the election. And then once the prosecution realized that they were getting their butts handed to them by the defense, about 1/3 of the way through that 9-week trial, they switched gears and it became a conspiracy of that was hatched on the Capitol steps in the moment. It was a conspiracy of mental telepathy. Seriously.
Right. It's instantaneous. Yes. Conspiracy. People.
And it was a spontaneous combustion of conspiracy with no words spoken between any of those individuals. And I'll never forget, I was there for the sentencing hearing, and Judge Amit Mehta said to Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers, and this is a paraphrase, but he said, you're smart, you're eloquent, and you know how to lead men. Therefore, you're a danger to society. I'm going to put you away for 18 years.
That's it right there.
Right there.
I think so much of these prosecutions have not just been going after people, but making examples in order to say that don't ever do this again, don't ever gather again, don't ever speak out again. This is what it feels like for me, and I'm a little bit too emotionally involved in this for any kind of journalistic activity. This is certainly not that. This is advocacy at my, I'll own it, and it's definitely it's an emotional opinion that I have. But watching the way that people are treated, watching the subjugation of whistleblowers and making the examples of them, the way that my buddy Garrett said, he went out in front of Congress and said, this government will crush you. This government should have no interest in one thing or another. It should only be interested in providing the service that it does and be limited in that scope. And instead, it is aggressively pursuing actions that benefit not the people, but the government specifically. Like the agencies of the government are out there pursuing their own ends. That is the definition of weaponization to me. You have any thoughts on where this ends for you?
Where it ends for me right now is still an unknown. We have made the decision, as you know, in a subpoena for my video, I have the ability to opt to send that to them electronically or to actually hand it over to the agent in charge. And so in consultation with my attorney yesterday, we decided that I'm going to appear. I'm going up next Wednesday, and I'm going to face the grand jury. I'm going to say, what the hell's up?
Mm-hmm.
So
they do have the possibility of at least asking questions during that, which is a possibility. So that might be interesting for you.
Yeah, it should be interesting. But the easy route would have been for me to just hand them a flash drive with my videos on it. But I've decided to make an appearance there next Wednesday in D.C. At the district courthouse. So where it goes from there, I don't know. Where I go from there, I don't know. I'll tell you that I told my children more than 2 years ago. They're adults. I told them, I said, because of the work I'm doing, I said, there's a high likelihood that your father will not finish his life as a free man. And I prepped them for that, for a long time. And I'm not either patting myself on the back or trying to execute a grift here of some sort. But Kyle, I think I think I've told you offline before one of the stories that I'm working on, and it's explosive. And I have read House Weaponization Committee investigators have been read into this story. I spent 4.5 hours with them 2 weeks ago. Investigative members of the Heritage Foundation have been read into this story, as well as a couple of other friendly journalists, so that if anything happens to me, if I'm Clintonized or Arkansided or whatever you want to call it, this story is still going to come out. And it is a January 6th story that is explosive. And everyone who has seen this story so far has said that this is going to be the first cornerstone of the House of Cards to be pulled out from the January 6th narrative. And the most significant part of this story, and this is why I don't believe that this timing of this re-engagement of our reinitiation into prosecuting me some 20 months later, is that I have absolutely no doubt that they are not aware of this story. And it specifically implicates the FBI and the DOJ in conspiracy and cover-up, specifically in these a couple of these trials.
And not only that, but the fact that we know that senior FBI executives were pushing the specific narrative that I think that you can pull out on, amongst other things, but that they're committed to it.
Yeah.
They committed their careers to it, and they rode that wave up to the top of positions that they shouldn't have ever been holding.
Yeah.
And then, and they have a vested interest in concealing it, I think.
Yeah. So that's where this leads is interesting. It's what a time to be alive, huh?
A strange time indeed, and a strange time, sad time for America. Like I said, I do believe that the America that I grew up in would have invaded the America that I live in. Yeah. And I will say it again because this is what the Banana Republic looks like. And when you start undermining your judiciary, then you end up in a world where you can't trust it. Tell people if they're interested in your journalism where they can go and do that. We'll throw that up there. It's going to be in the show notes as well, but give them kind of a verbal if you would. Yeah,
the easy way and the short way to type it is just to go to tpc4usa.com, tpc4usa.com, and that is my locals community. It's free to subscribe, but for as little as $5 a month, as we mentioned before, you can support the work that I am doing. And I've not set up a Gibson Go yet. I'm not going to do that unless I am indicted. But yeah, there we go. There's the image for that. And then, of course, with the same exact handle, TPC4USA, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook and True Social. So I've simplified it. And then, of course, obviously my Rumble channel is where I put all my videos out.
And the Rumble channel is the same thing. TPC, the number 4 USA. They can go and search that and they'll find that. You did a really good interview recently with TK Johnson, as well as a bunch of others, and some of your digging into what did and did not get investigated on the January 6th front, which is a lot of things that did not. That seemed very interesting.
And a lot of things that have been investigated that have yet to be revealed.
That's fair.
A couple of juicy bits coming.
Well, I hope that folks, I hope you can share this video. And the reason why is because the noise is part of the safety cloud that we build for guys like Steve, for guys like me. Honestly, this is one of the reasons why I do what I do. It's one of the reasons why Steve has no choice but to do what he's doing. Why people like Garrett O'Boyle and Steve Friend, like my buddies who have done the verbal cover we have, the media cover, is that they know in the court of public appeal, the case is already being waged, and they're trying to stifle it. Literally in word, they are putting it in writing that they would like to stop that sort of thing, so they can just have you shut up and take your lumps, and the government can continue on with its weaponized process. So that's really scary stuff. Steve, thanks for sharing a lot of the stuff. Thanks always for being candid with us. And anytime you want to come back on and chat, we can do it for long or short as you like. And we will promote this stuff as much. I'm going to try to get some other podcasts and some other types involved. So. Awesome. We'll keep getting your story out there. And then your handles on Truth and Twitter are the same. The TP number 4 USA. TPC, exactly. The number 4 USA, which I follow, folks. You'll see me post some of Steve's stuff. Thanks so much for joining me this morning, buddy. I'm going to go down and shut the day down and then panic about how bad our existence is right now in this country, which is terrible. Every time we talk, it's not a great feeling, although I enjoy your company.
But we're in it for the long haul. We're in it for the
That's it. Yeah, no other choice on that.
That's it.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to The Kyle Seraphin Show. We are streamed live from Liberty Hill, Texas. We do want to thank a couple of people. First of all, we're going to thank you for being here and for joining us. We want to thank the new monthly subscribers that we have on Rumble, and we've got a 5-star review. As you know, you can post them on Apple, nearly 650 strong so far, and we appreciate every one of them, including this one from Paige NOR. I don't know if there was more to that, maybe Paige Noir. It says, always informative, Kyle and all. I love your podcast. I learned so much, and I enjoy your guests. I hope you enjoyed having Steve Baker on here, rather. The Pragmatic Constitutionalist, ladies and gentlemen, TPC, the Pragmatic Constitutionalist, the number 4 USA, TPC, number 4 USA. Don't forget to like this on Rumble if you haven't done it already. Scroll down, hit that like button, leave us a comment in there. If you have something, you can always go and you can tweet or you can truth it at Steve Baker, and give him your support as things go on. You can sign up for his locals if you like, and please make sure that if you're not subscribed to our Rumble channel, that you do so. We really appreciate those as well. Until then, we'll see you guys again on Wednesday. Sorry to leave you on a heavy note on this Tuesday, but we went a little long because I think the story involves a little bit more than normal. Again, we'll see you again on Tuesday, and hang in there. It's going to be an interesting day.
Thanks for listening to The Kyle Seraphin Show, streamed live weekdays on rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. Follow Kyle on Twitter, Truth Social, and Instagram at Kyle Seraphin.